Chapter 6. The Landing on the Moon. I remember how one day Cavor suddenly opened 6 of our shutters and blinded me so that I cried aloud at him. The whole area was moon, a stupendous scimitar of white dawn with its edge hacked out by notches of darkness, the crescent shore of an ebbing tide of darkness, out of which peaks and pinnacles came glittering into the blaze of the sun. I take it the reader has seen pictures or photographs of the moon, and that I need not describe the broader features of that landscape, those spacious ring-like ranges, vaster than any terrestrial mountains, their summits shining in the day, their shadows harsh and deep, the grey disordered plains, the ridges, hills, and craterlets, all passing at last from a blazing illumination into a common mystery of black. Athwart this world we were flying scarcely 100 miles above its crests and pinnacles, and now we could see, what no eye on earth will ever see, that under the blaze of the day the harsh outlines of the rocks and ravines of the plains and crater floor grew grey and indistinct under a thickening haze, that the white of their lit surfaces broke into lumps and patches, and broke again, and shrank and vanished, and that here and there strange tints of brown and olive grew and spread. But little time we had for watching then, for now we had come to the real danger of our journey. We had to drop ever closer to the moon as we spun about it, to slacken our pace and watch our chance, until at last we could dare to drop upon its surface. For Cavor that was a time of intense exertion. For me, it was an anxious inactivity. I seemed perpetually to be getting out of his way. He leaped about the sphere from point to point with an agility that would have been impossible on earth. He was perpetually opening and closing the Cavorite windows, making calculations, consulting his chronometer by means of the glow lamp during those last eventful hours. For a long time we had all our windows closed and hung silently in darkness, hurling through space. Then he was feeling for the shutter studs, and suddenly 4 windows were open. I staggered and covered my eyes, drenched and scorched and blinded by the unaccustomed splendor of the sun beneath my feet. Then again the shutters snapped, leaving my brain spinning in a darkness that pressed against the eyes, and after that I floated in another vast black silence. Then Cavor switched on the electric light, and told me he proposed to bind all our luggage together with the blankets about it, against the concussion of our descent. We did this with our windows closed, because in that way our goods arranged themselves naturally at the center of the sphere. That, too, was a strange business, we 2 men floating loose in that spherical space, and packing and pulling ropes. Imagine it if you can. No up nor down, and every effort resulting in unexpected movements. Now I would be pressed against the glass with the full force of Cavor's thrust. Now I would be kicking helplessly in a void. Now the star of the electric light would be overhead, now underfoot. Now Cavor's feet would float up before my eyes, and now we would be crossways to each other. But at last our goods were safely bound together in a big soft bale, all except 2 blankets with head holes that we were to wrap about ourselves. Then for a flash Cavor opened a window moonward, and we saw that we were dropping towards a huge central crater with a number of minor craters grouped in a sort of cross about it. And then again Cavor flung our little sphere open to the scorching, blinding sun. I think he was using the sun's attraction as a brake. "Cover yourself with a blanket," he cried, thrusting himself from me, and for a moment I did not understand. Then I hauled the blanket from beneath my feet and got it about me and over my head and eyes. Abruptly he closed the shutters again, snapped one open again and closed it, then suddenly began snapping them all open, each safely into its steel roller. There came a jar, and then we were rolling over and over, bumping against the glass and against the big bale of our luggage, and clutching at each other. and outside some white substance splashed as if we were rolling down a slope of snow. Over, clutch, bump, over, came a thud, and I was half buried under the bale of our possessions, and for a space everything was still. Then I could hear Cavor puffing and grunting, and the snapping of a shutter in its sash. I made an effort, thrust back our blanket-wrapped luggage, and emerged from beneath it. Our open windows were just visible as a deeper black set with stars. We were still alive, and we were lying in the darkness of the shadow of the wall of the great crater into which we had fallen. We sat getting our breath again, and feeling the bruises on our limbs. I don't think either of us had had a very clear expectation of such rough handling as we had received. I struggled painfully to my feet. "And now," said I, "to look at the landscape of the moon. But it's tremendously dark, Cavor." The glass was dewy, and as I spoke I wiped at it with my blanket. "We're half an hour or so beyond the day," he said. "We must wait." It was impossible to distinguish anything. We might have been in a sphere of steel for all that we could see. My rubbing with the blanket simply smeared the glass, and as fast as I wiped it, it became opaque again with freshly condensed moisture mixed with an increasing quantity of blanket hairs. Of course I ought not to have used the blanket. In my efforts to clear the glass, I slipped upon the damp surface, and hurt my shin against one of the oxygen cylinders that protruded from our bale. The thing was exasperating. It was absurd. Here we were just arrived upon the moon, amidst we knew not what wonders, and all we could see was the grey and streaming wall of the bubble in which we had come. "Confound it!" I said, "but at this rate we might have stopped at home." And I squatted on the bale and shivered, and drew my blanket closer about me. Abruptly the moisture turned to spangles and fronds of frost. "Can you reach the electric heater?" said Cavor. "Yes, that black knob, or we shall freeze." I did not wait to be told twice. "And now," said I, "what are we to do?" "Wait," he said. "Wait?" "Of course. We shall have to wait until our air gets warm again, and then this glass will clear. We can't do anything till then. It's night here yet. We must wait for the day to overtake us. Meanwhile, don't you feel hungry?" For a space I did not answer him, but sat fretting. I turned reluctantly from the smeared puzzle of the glass and stared at his face. "Yes," I said, "I am hungry. I feel somehow enormously disappointed. I had expected... I don't know what I had expected, but not this." I summoned my philosophy, and rearranging my blanket about me, sat down on the bale again, and began my first meal on the moon. I don't think I finished it. I forget. Presently, first in patches, then running rapidly together into wider spaces, came the clearing of the glass, came the drawing of the misty veil that hid the moon world from our eyes. We peered out upon the landscape of the moon. Chapter 7. Sunrise on the Moon. As we saw it first, it was the wildest and most desolate of scenes. We were in an enormous amphitheatre, a vast circular plain, the floor of the giant crater. Its cliff-like walls closed us in on every side. From the westward the light of the unseen sun fell upon them, reaching to the very foot of the cliff, and showed a disordered escarpment of drab and greyish rock, lined here and there with banks and crevices of snow. This was perhaps a dozen miles away, but at first no intervening atmosphere diminished in the slightest the minutely detailed brilliancy with which these things glared at us. They stood out clear and dazzling against a background of starry blackness that seemed to our earthly eyes rather a gloriously spangled velvet curtain than the spaciousness of the sky. The eastward cliff was at first merely a starless selvage to the starry dome. No rosy flush, no creeping pallor announced the commencing day. Only the corona, the zodiacal light, a huge cone-shaped luminous haze pointing up towards the splendor of the morning star, warned us of the imminent nearness of the sun. Whatever light was about us was reflected by the westward cliffs. It showed a huge undulating plain, cold and grey, a grey that deepened eastward into the absolute raven darkness of the cliff shadow. Innumerable rounded grey summits, ghostly hummocks, billows of snowy substance, stretching crest beyond crest into the remote obscurity, gave us our first inkling of the distance of the crater wall. These hummocks looked like snow. At the time I thought they were snow. But they were not. They were mounds and masses of frozen air. So it was at first, and then, sudden, swift, and amazing, came the lunar day. The sunlight had crept down the cliff. It touched the drifted masses at its base and incontinently came striding with 7-leagued boots towards us. The distant cliff seemed to shift and quiver, and at the touch of the dawn, a reek of grey vapour poured upward from the crater floor, whirls and puffs and drifting wraiths of grey, thicker and broader and denser, until at last the whole westward plain was steaming like a wet handkerchief held before the fire, and the westward cliffs were no more than refracted glare beyond. "It is air," said Cavor. "It must be air, or it would not rise like this, at the mere touch of a sunbeam, and at this pace." He peered upwards. "Look," he said. "What?" I asked. "In the sky. Already, on the blackness, a little touch of blue. See? The stars seem larger. And the little ones and all those dim nebulosities we saw in empty space, they are hidden." Swiftly, steadily, the day approached us. Grey summit after grey summit was overtaken by the blaze, and turned to a smoking white intensity. At last there was nothing to the west of us but a bank of surging fog, the tumultuous advance and ascent of cloudy haze. The distant cliff had receded farther and farther, had loomed and changed through the whirl, and foundered and vanished at last in its confusion. Nearer came that steaming advance, nearer and nearer, coming as fast as the shadow of a cloud before the southwest wind. About us rose a thin anticipatory haze. Cavor gripped my arm. "What?" I said. "Look! The sunrise! The sun!" He turned me about and pointed to the brow of the eastward cliff, looming above the haze about us, scarce lighter than the darkness of the sky. But now its line was marked by strange reddish shapes, tongues of vermilion flame that writhed and danced. I fancied it must be spirals of vapour that had caught the light and made this crest of fiery tongues against the sky, but indeed it was the solar prominences I saw, a crown of fire about the sun that is forever hidden from earthly eyes by our atmospheric veil. And then the sun. Steadily, inevitably came a brilliant line, came a thin edge of intolerable effulgence that took a circular shape, became a bow, became a blazing sceptre, and hurled a shaft of heat at us as though it was a spear. It seemed verily to stab my eyes. I cried aloud and turned about blinded, groping for my blanket beneath the bale. And with that incandescence came a sound, the first sound that had reached us from without since we left the earth, a hissing and rustling, the stormy trailing of the aerial garment of the advancing day. And with the coming of the sound and the light, the sphere lurched, and blinded and dazzled we staggered helplessly against each other. It lurched again, and the hissing grew louder. I had shut my eyes perforce. I was making clumsy efforts to cover my head with my blanket, and this second lurch sent me helplessly off my feet. I fell against the bale, and opening my eyes had a momentary glimpse of the air just outside our glass. It was running, it was boiling, like snow into which a white-hot rod is thrust. What had been solid air had suddenly, at the touch of the sun, become a paste, a mud, a slushy liquefaction that hissed and bubbled into gas. There came a still more violent whirl of the sphere, and we had clutched one another. In another moment we were spun about again. Round we went, and over, and then I was on all fours. The lunar dawn had hold of us. It meant to show us little men what the moon could do with us. I caught a second glimpse of things without. Puffs of vapor, half-liquid slush, excavated, sliding, falling, sliding. We dropped into darkness. I went down with Cavor's knees in my chest. Then he seemed to fly away from me, and for a moment I lay with all the breath out of my body, staring upward. A toppling crag of the melting stuff had splashed over us, buried us, and now it thinned and boiled off us. I saw the bubbles dancing on the glass above. I heard Cavor exclaiming feebly. Then some huge landslip in the thawing air had caught us, and spluttering expostulation we began to roll down a slope, rolling faster and faster, leaping crevasses and rebounding from banks, faster and faster, westward into the white-hot boiling tumult of the lunar day. Clutching at one another, we spun about, pitched this way and that, our bale of packages leaping at us, pounding at us. We collided, we gripped, we were torn asunder. Our heads met, and the whole universe burst into fiery darts and stars. On the earth we should have smashed one another a dozen times, but on the moon, luckily for us, our weight was only 1/6 of what it is terrestrially, and we fell very mercifully. I recall a sensation of utter sickness, a feeling as if my brain were upside down inside my skull, and then something was at work upon my face. Some thin feelers worried my ears. Then I discovered the brilliance of the landscape around was mitigated by blue spectacles. Cavor bent over me, and I saw his face upside down, his eyes also protected by tinted goggles. His breath came irregularly, and his lip was bleeding from a bruise. "Better?" he said, wiping the blood with the back of his hand. Everything seemed swaying for a space, but that was simply my giddiness. I perceived that he had closed some of the shutters in the outer sphere to save me from the direct blaze of the sun. I was aware that everything about us was very brilliant. "Lord!" I gasped. "But this—" I craned my neck to see. I perceived there was a blinding glare outside, an utter change from the gloomy darkness of our first impressions. "Have I been insensible long?" I asked. "I don't know. The chronometer's broken. Some little time. My dear chap, I have been afraid." I lay for a space, taking this in. I saw his face still bore evidences of emotion. For a while I said nothing. I passed an inquisitive hand over my contusions, and surveyed his face for similar damages. The back of my right hand had suffered most, and was skinless and raw. My forehead was bruised and had bled. He handed me a little measure with some of the restorative, I forget the name of it, he had brought with us. After a time I felt a little better. I began to stretch my limbs carefully. Soon I could talk. "It wouldn't have done," I said, as though there had been no interval. "No, it wouldn't." He thought, his hands hanging over his knees. He peered through the glass and then stared at me. "Good Lord," he said. "No!" "What has happened?" I asked after a pause. "Have we jumped to the tropics?" "It was as I expected. This air has evaporated, if it is air. At any rate, it has evaporated, and the surface of the moon is showing. We are lying on a bank of earthy rock. Here and there bare soil is exposed. A queer sort of soil." It occurred to him that it was unnecessary to explain. He assisted me into a sitting position, and I could see with my own eyes. End of chapter. Chapter 8. A Lunar Morning. the harsh emphasis, the pitiless black and white of scenery had altogether disappeared. The glare of the sun had taken upon itself a faint tinge of amber. The shadows upon the cliff of the crater wall were deeply purple. To the eastward, a dark bank of fog still crouched and sheltered from the sunrise, but to the westward the sky was blue and clear. I began to realize the length of my insensibility. We were no longer in a void. An atmosphere had arisen about us. The outline of things had gained in character, had grown acute and varied, save for a shadowed space of white substance here and there, white substance that was no longer air but snow. The Arctic appearance had gone altogether. Everywhere broad, rusty brown spaces of bare and tumbled earth spread to the blaze of the sun. Here and there at the edge of the snowdrifts were transient little pools and eddies of water, the only things stirring in that expanse of barrenness. The sunlight inundated the upper two blinds of our sphere and turned our climate to high summer, but our feet were still in shadow, and the sphere was lying upon a drift of snow. And scattered here and there upon the slope, and emphasized by little white threads of unthawed snow upon their shady sides, were shapes like sticks, dry, twisted sticks of the same rusty hue as the rock upon which they lay. That caught one's thoughts sharply. Sticks! On a lifeless world? Then, as my eye grew more accustomed to the texture of their substance, I perceived that almost all this surface had a fibrous texture, like the carpet of brown needles one finds beneath the shade of pine trees. "Cavor!" I said. "Yes?" "It may be a dead world now, but once—" Something arrested my attention. I had discovered among these needles a number of little round objects, and it seemed to me that one of these had moved. "Cavor!" I whispered. "What?" But I did not answer at once. I stared incredulous. For an instant I could not believe my eyes. I gave an inarticulate cry. I gripped his arm. I pointed. "Look!" I cried, finding my tongue. "There! Yes, and there!" His eyes followed my pointing finger. "Eh?" he said. How can I describe the thing I saw? It is so petty a thing to state, and yet it seems so wonderful, so pregnant with emotion. I have said that amidst the stick-like litter were these rounded bodies, these little oval bodies that might have passed as very small pebbles. And now first one, and then another, had stirred, had rolled over and cracked, and down the crack of each of them showed a minute line of yellowish green, thrusting outward to meet the hot encouragement of the newly risen sun. For a moment that was all, and then there stirred and burst a third. "It is a seed," said Cavor, and then I heard him whisper very softly, "Life." Life! And immediately it poured upon us that our vast journey had not been made in vain, that we had come to no arid waste of minerals, but to a world that lived and moved. We watched intensely. I remember I kept rubbing the glass before me with my sleeve, jealous of the faintest suspicion of mist. The picture was clear and vivid only in the middle of the field. All about that center the dead fibers and seeds were magnified and distorted by the curvature of the glass, but we could see enough. One after another, all down the sunlit slope, these miraculous little brown bodies burst and gaped apart, like seed pods, like the husk of fruits, open eager mouths that drank in the heat and light pouring in a cascade from the newly risen sun. Every moment more of these seed coats ruptured, and even as they did so the swelling pioneers overflowed their rent distended seed cases and passed into the second stage of growth. With a steady assurance, a swift deliberation, these amazing seeds thrust a rootlet downward to the earth and a queer little bundle-like bud into the air. In a little while the whole slope was dotted with minute plantlets standing at attention in the blaze of the sun. They did not stand for long. The bundle-like buds swelled and strained and opened with a jerk, thrusting out a coronet of little sharp tips, spreading a whorl of tiny, spiky, brownish leaves that lengthened rapidly, lengthened visibly even as we watched. The movement was slower than any animal's, swifter than any plant's I have ever seen before. How can I suggest it to you, the way that growth went on? The leaf tips grew so that they moved onward even while we looked at them. The brown seed case shriveled and was absorbed with an equal rapidity. Have you ever, on a cold day, taken a thermometer into your warm hand and watched the little thread of mercury creep up the tube? These moon plants grew like that. In a few minutes, as it seemed, the buds of the more forward of these plants had lengthened into a stem and were even putting forth a second whorl of leaves, and all the slope that had seemed so recently a lifeless stretch of litter was now dark with the stunted olive-green herbage of bristling spikes that swayed with the vigor of their growing. I turned about, and behold! Along the upper edge of a rock to the eastward, a similar fringe in a scarcely less forward condition swayed and bent, dark against the blinding glare of the sun. And beyond this fringe was the silhouette of a plant mass, branching clumsily like a cactus, and swelling visibly, swelling like a bladder that fills with air. Then to the westward also I discovered that another such distended form was rising over the scrub. But here the light fell upon its sleek sides, and I could see that its color was a vivid orange hue. It rose as one watched it. If one looked away from it for a minute and then back, its outline had changed. It thrust out blunt, congested branches until in a little time it rose a coralline shape of many feet in height. Compared with such a growth, the terrestrial puffball, which will sometimes swell a foot in diameter in a single night, would be a hopeless laggard. But then the puffball grows against the gravitational pull 6 times that of the moon. Beyond, out of gullies and flats that had been hidden from us, but not from the quickening sun, over reefs and banks of shining rock, a bristling beard of spiky and fleshy vegetation was straining into view, hurrying tumultuously to take advantage of the brief day in which it must flower and fruit and seed again and die. It was like a miracle, that growth. So, one must imagine, the trees and plants arose at the creation and covered the desolation of the new-made earth. Imagine it. Imagine that dawn. The resurrection of the frozen air, the stirring and quickening of the soil, and then this silent uprising of vegetation, this unearthly ascent of fleshiness and spikes. Conceive it all lit by a blaze that would make the intensest sunlight of earth seem watery and weak, and still around this stirring jungle, wherever there was shadow, lingered banks of bluish snow. And to have the picture of our impression complete, you must bear in mind that we saw it all through a thick bent glass, distorting it as things are distorted by a lens, acute only in the center of the picture, and very bright there, and towards the edges magnified and unreal. Chapter 9. Prospecting begins. We cease to gaze. We turn to each other, the same thought, the same question in our eyes. For these plants to grow, there must be some air, however attenuated, air that we also should be able to breathe. "The manhole?" I said. "Yes," said Cavor, "if it is air we see." "In a little while," I said, "these plants will be as high as we are. Suppose after all—" "Is it certain? How do you know that stuff is air? It may be nitrogen. It may be carbonic acid even." "That's easy," he said, and set about proving it. He produced a big piece of crumpled paper from the bale, lit it, and thrust it hastily through the manhole valve. I bent forward and peered down through the thick glass for its appearance outside, that little flame on whose evidence depended so much. I saw the paper drop out and lie lightly upon the snow. The pink flame of its burning vanished. For an instant it seemed to be extinguished. And then I saw a little blue tongue upon the edge of it that trembled, and crept, and spread. Quietly the whole sheet, save where it lay in immediate contact with the snow, charred and shriveled and sent up a quivering thread of smoke. There was no doubt left to me. The atmosphere of the moon was either pure oxygen or air, and capable, therefore, unless its tenuity was excessive, of supporting our alien life. We might emerge and live. I sat down with my legs on either side of the manhole and prepared to unscrew it, but Cavor stopped me. "There is first a little precaution," he said. He pointed out that although it was certainly an oxygenated atmosphere outside, it might still be so rarefied as to cause us grave injury. He reminded me of mountain sickness, and of the bleeding that often afflicts aeronauts who have ascended too swiftly, and he spent some time in the preparation of a sickly-tasting drink which he insisted on my sharing. It made me feel a little numb, but otherwise had no effect on me. Then he permitted me to begin unscrewing. Presently the glass stopper of the manhole was so far undone that the denser air within our sphere began to escape along the thread of the screw, singing as a kettle sings before it boils. Thereupon he made me desist. It speedily became evident that the pressure outside was very much less than it was within. How much less it was we had no means of telling. I sat grasping the stopper with both hands, ready to close it again if, in spite of our intense hope, the lunar atmosphere should after all prove too rarefied for us, and Cavor sat with a cylinder of compressed oxygen at hand to restore our pressure. We looked at one another in silence, and then at the fantastic vegetation that swayed and grew visibly and noiselessly without, and ever that shrill piping continued. My blood vessels began to throb in my ears, and the sound of Cavor's movements diminished. I noted how still everything had become, because of the thinning of the air. As our air sizzled out from the screw, the moisture of it condensed in little puffs. Presently I experienced a peculiar shortness of breath that lasted indeed during the whole of the time of our exposure to the moon's exterior atmosphere, and a rather unpleasant sensation about the ears and fingernails and the back of the throat grew upon my attention, and presently passed off again. But then came vertigo and nausea that abruptly changed the quality of my courage. I gave the lid of the manhole half a turn and made a hasty explanation to Cavor, but now he was the more sanguine. He answered me in a voice that seemed extraordinarily small and remote, because of the thinness of the air that carried the sound. He recommended a nip of brandy, and set me the example, and presently I felt better. I turned the manhole stopper back again. The throbbing in my ears grew louder, and then I remarked that the piping note of the outrush had ceased. For a time I could not be sure that it had ceased. "Well?" said Cavor in the ghost of a voice. "Well?" said I. "Shall we go on?" I thought. "Is this all?" "If you can stand it." By way of answer I went on unscrewing. I lifted the circular operculum from its place and laid it carefully on the bale. A flake or so of snow whirled and vanished as that thin and unfamiliar air took possession of our sphere. I knelt, and then seated myself at the edge of the manhole, peering over it. Beneath, within a yard of my face, lay the untrodden snow of the moon. There came a little pause. Our eyes met. "It doesn't distress your lungs too much?" said Cavor. "No," I said. "I can stand this." He stretched out his hand for his blanket, thrust his head through its central hole, and wrapped it about him. He sat down on the edge of the manhole. He let his feet drop until they were within 6 inches of the lunar ground. He hesitated for a moment, then thrust himself forward, dropped those intervening inches, and stood upon the untrodden soil of the moon. As he stepped forward he was refracted grotesquely by the edge of the glass. He stood for a moment looking this way and that. Then he drew himself together and leapt. The glass distorted everything, but it seemed to me even then to be an extremely big leap. He had at one bound become remote. He seemed 20 or 30 feet off. He was standing high upon a rocky mass and gesticulating back to me. Perhaps he was shouting, but the sound did not reach me. But how the deuce had he done this? I felt like a man who has just seen a new conjuring trick. In a puzzled state of mind, I too dropped through the manhole. I stood up. Just in front of me, the snowdrift had fallen away and made a sort of ditch. I made a step and jumped. I found myself flying through the air, saw the rock on which he stood coming to meet me, clutched it and clung in a state of infinite amazement. I gasped a painful laugh. I was tremendously confused. Cavor bent down and shouted in piping tones for me to be careful. I had forgotten that on the moon, with only an eighth part of the earth's mass and a quarter of its diameter, my weight was barely a sixth what it was on earth. But now that fact insisted on being remembered. "We are out of Mother Earth's leading strings now," he said. With a guarded effort I raised myself to the top, and moving as cautiously as a rheumatic patient, stood up beside him under the blaze of the sun. The sphere lay behind us on its dwindling snowdrift, 30 feet away. As far as the eye could see over the enormous disorder of rocks that formed the crater floor, the same bristling scrub that surrounded us was starting into life, diversified here and there by bulging masses of a cactus form, and scarlet and purple lichens that grew so fast they seemed to crawl over the rocks. The whole area of the crater seemed to me then to be one similar wilderness up to the very foot of the surrounding cliff. This cliff was apparently bare of vegetation, save at its base, and with buttresses and terraces and platforms that did not very greatly attract our attention at the time. It was many miles away from us in every direction. We seemed to be almost at the center of the crater, and we saw it through a certain haziness that drove before the wind. For there was even a wind now in the thin air, a swift yet weak wind that chilled exceedingly but exerted little pressure. It was blowing round the crater, as it seemed, to the hot illuminated side from the foggy darkness under the sunward wall. It was difficult to look into this eastward fog. We had to peer with half-closed eyes beneath the shade of our hands because of the fierce intensity of the motionless sun. "It seems to be deserted," said Cavor. "Absolutely desolate." I looked about me again. I retained even then a clinging hope of some quasi-human evidence, some pinnacle of building, some house or engine, but everywhere one looked spread the tumbled rocks in peaks and crests, and the darting scrub and those bulging cacti that swelled and swelled, a flat negation, as it seemed, of all such hope. "It looks as though these plants had it to themselves," I said. "I see no trace of any other creature." "No insects, no birds, no, not a trace, not a scrap nor particle of animal life. If there was, what would they do in the night? No, there's just these plants alone." I shaded my eyes with my hand. "It's like the landscape of a dream. These things are less like earthly land plants than the things one imagines among the rocks at the bottom of the sea. Look at that yonder. One might imagine it is a lizard changed into a plant. And the glare!" "This is only the fresh morning," said Cavor. He sighed and looked about him. "This is no world for men," he said. "And yet, in a way, it appeals." He became silent for a time, then commenced his meditative humming. I started at a gentle touch, and found a thin sheet of livid lichen lapping over my shoe. I kicked at it, and it fell to powder, and each speck began to grow. I heard Cavor exclaim sharply, and perceived that one of the fixed bayonets of the scrub had pricked him. He hesitated, his eyes sought among the rocks about us. A sudden blaze of pink had crept up a ragged pillar of crag. It was most extraordinary pink, a livid magenta. "Look," said I, turning, and behold Cavor had vanished. For an instant I stood transfixed. Then I made a hasty step to look over the verge of the rock. But in my surprise at his disappearance I forgot once more that we were on the moon. The thrust of my foot that I made in striding would have carried me a yard on earth. On the moon it carried me 6, a good 5 yards over the edge. For a moment the thing had something of the effect of those nightmares when one falls and falls. For while one falls 16 feet in the first second of a fall on earth, on the moon one falls 2, and with only 1/6 of one's weight. I fell, or rather I jumped down, about 10 yards, I suppose. It seemed to take quite a long time, 5 or 6 seconds, I should think. I floated through the air and fell like a feather, knee-deep in a snowdrift in the bottom of a gully of blue-grey, white-veined rock. I looked about me. "Cavor!" I cried. But no Cavor was visible. "Cavor!" I cried louder, and the rocks echoed me. I turned fiercely to the rocks and clambered to the summit of them. "Cavor!" I cried. My voice sounded like the voice of a lost lamb. The sphere, too, was not in sight, and for a moment a horrible feeling of desolation pinched my heart. Then I saw him. He was laughing and gesticulating to attract my attention. He was on a bare patch of rock 20 or 30 yards away. I could not hear his voice, but "Jump!" said his gestures. I hesitated. The distance seemed enormous. Yet I reflected that surely I must be able to clear a greater distance than Cavor. I made a step back, gathered myself together, and leaped with all my might. I seemed to shoot right up in the air as though I should never come down. It was horrible and delightful and as wild as a nightmare to go flying off in this fashion. I realized my leap had been altogether too violent. I flew clean over Cavor's head and beheld a spiky confusion in a gully spreading to meet my fall. I gave a yelp of alarm. I put out my hands and straightened my legs. I hit a huge fungoid bulk that burst all about me, scattering a mass of orange spores in every direction, and covering me with orange powder. I rolled over spluttering, and came to rest convulsed with breathless laughter. I became aware of Cavor's little round face peering over a bristling hedge. He shouted some faded inquiry. "Eh?" I tried to shout, but could not do so for want of breath. He made his way towards me, coming gingerly among the bushes. "We've got to be careful," he said. "This moon has no discipline. She'll let us smash ourselves." He helped me to my feet. "You exerted yourself too much," he said, dabbing at the yellow stuff with his hand to remove it from my garments. I stood passive and panting, allowing him to beat off the jelly from my knees and elbows and lecture me upon my misfortunes. "We don't quite allow for the gravitation. Our muscles are scarcely educated yet. We must practice a little, when you have got your breath." I pulled 2 or 3 little thorns out of my hand and sat for a time on a boulder of rock. My muscles were quivering, and I had that feeling of personal disillusionment that comes at the first fall to the learner of cycling on earth. It suddenly occurred to Cavor that the cold air in the gully, after the brightness of the sun, might give me a fever. So we clambered back into the sunlight. We found that beyond a few abrasions I had received no serious injuries from my tumble, and at Cavor's suggestion we were presently looking round for some safe and easy landing place for my next leap. We chose a rocky slab some 10 yards off, separated from us by a little thicket of olive-green spikes. "Imagine it there," said Cavor, who was assuming the airs of a trainer, and he pointed to a spot about 4 feet from my toes. This leap I managed without difficulty, and I must confess I found a certain satisfaction in Cavor's falling short by a foot or so, and tasting the spikes of the scrub. "One has to be careful, you see," he said, pulling out his thorns, and with that he ceased to be my mentor and became my fellow learner in the art of lunar locomotion. We chose a still easier jump and did it without difficulty, and then leaped back again, and to and fro several times, accustoming our muscles to the new standard. I could never have believed, had I not experienced it, how rapid that adaptation would be. In a very little time indeed, certainly after fewer than 30 leaps, we could judge the effort necessary for a distance with almost terrestrial assurance. And all this time the lunar plants were growing around us, higher and denser and more entangled. Every moment thicker and taller, spiked plants, green cactus masses, fungi, fleshy and lichenous things, strangest radiate and sinuous shapes. But we were so intent upon our leaping that for a time we gave no heed to their unfaltering expansion. An extraordinary elation had taken possession of us. Partly, I think, it was our sense of release from the confinement of the sphere. Mainly, however, the thin sweetness of the air, which I am certain contained a much larger proportion of oxygen than our terrestrial atmosphere. In spite of the strange quality of all about us, I felt as adventurous and experimental as a cockney would do, placed for the first time among mountains, and I do not think it occurred to either of us, face to face though we were with the unknown, to be very greatly afraid. We were bitten by a spirit of enterprise. We selected a lichenous kopje perhaps 15 yards away, and landed neatly on its summit, one after the other. "Good!" we cried to each other. "Good!" And Cavor made 3 steps and went off in a tempting slope of snow a good 20 yards and more beyond. I stood for a moment struck by the grotesque effect of his soaring figure, his dirty cricket cap and spiky hair, his little round body, his arms and his knickerbockered legs tucked up tightly, against the weird spaciousness of the lunar scene. A gust of laughter seized me, and then I stepped off to follow. Plump! I dropped beside him. We made a few gargantuan strides, leaped 3 or 4 times more, and sat down at last in a lichenous hollow. Our lungs were painful. We sat holding our sides and recovering our breath, looking appreciation to one another. Cavor panted something about amazing sensations, and then came a thought into my head. For the moment it did not seem a particularly appalling thought, simply a natural question arising out of the situation. "By the way," I said, "where exactly is the sphere?" Cavor looked at me. "Eh?" The full meaning of what we were saying struck me sharply. "Cavor!" I cried, laying a hand on his arm. "Where is the sphere?" End of chapter. Chapter 10. Lost Men in the Moon. His face caught something of my dismay. He stood up and stared about him at the scrub that fenced us in and rose about us, straining upward in a passion of growth. He put a dubious hand to his lips. He spoke with a sudden lack of assurance. "I think," he said slowly, "we left it somewhere about there." He pointed a hesitating finger that wavered in an arc. "I'm not sure." His look of consternation deepened. "Anyhow," he said, with his eyes on me, "it can't be far." We had both stood up. We made unmeaning ejaculations. Our eyes sought in the twining, thickening jungle round about us. All about us on the sunlit slopes frothed and swayed the darting shrubs, the swelling cactus, the creeping lichens, and wherever the shade remained, the snowdrifts lingered. North, south, east, and west spread an identical monotony of unfamiliar forms, and somewhere, buried already among this tangled confusion, was our sphere, our home, our only provision, our only hope of escape from this fantastic wilderness of ephemeral growths into which we had come. "I think, after all," he said, pointing suddenly, "it might be over there." "No," I said. "We have turned in a curve. See, here is the mark of my heels. It's clear the thing must be more to the eastward, much more. No, the sphere must be over there." "I think," said Cavor,
I kept the sun upon my right all the time." "Every leap, it seems to me," I said, "my shadow flew before me." We stared into one another's eyes. The area of the crater had become enormously vast to our imaginations, the growing thickets already impenetrably dense. "Good heavens, what fools we have been!" "It's evident that we must find it again," said Cavor, "and that soon. The sun grows stronger. We should be fainting with the heat already if it wasn't so dry, and I'm hungry." I stared at him. I had not suspected this aspect of the matter before, but it came to me at once, a positive craving. "Yes," I said with emphasis, "I am hungry too." He stood up with a look of active resolution. "Certainly, we must find the sphere." As calmly as possible we surveyed the interminable reefs and thickets that formed the floor of the crater, each of us weighing in silence the chances of our finding the sphere before we were overtaken by heat and hunger. "It can't be 50 yards from here," said Cavor with indecisive gestures. "The only thing is to beat round about until we come upon it." "That is all we can do," I said, without any alacrity to begin our hunt. "I wish this confounded spike bush did not grow so fast." "That's just it," said Cavor. "But it was lying on a bank of snow." I stared about me in the vain hope of recognizing some knoll or shrub that had been near the sphere, but everywhere was a confusing sameness, everywhere the aspiring bushes, the distending fungi, the dwindling snowbanks, steadily and inevitably changed. The sun scorched and stung. The faintness of an unaccountable hunger mingled with our infinite perplexity. And even as we stood there, confused and lost amidst unprecedented things, we became aware for the first time of a sound upon the moon other than the air of the growing plants, the faint sighing of the wind, or those that we ourselves had made. Boom, boom, boom. It came from beneath our feet, a sound in the earth. We seemed to hear it with our feet as much as with our ears. Its dull resonance was muffled by distance, thick with the quality of intervening substance. No sound that I can imagine could have astonished us more, or have changed more completely the quality of things about us, for this sound, rich, slow, and deliberate, seemed to us as though it could be nothing but the striking of some gigantic buried clock. Boom, boom, boom. Sound suggestive of still cloisters, of sleepless nights in crowded cities, of vigils and the awaited hour, of all that is orderly and methodical in life, booming out pregnant and mysterious in this fantastic desert. To the eye everything was unchanged. The desolation of bushes and cacti, waving silently in the wind, stretched unbroken to the distant cliffs. The still dark sky was empty overhead, and the hot sun hung and burned. And through it all, a warning, a threat, throbbed this enigma of sound. Boom, boom, boom. We questioned one another in faint and faded voices. A clock? Like a clock? What is it? What can it be? Count, was Cavor's belated suggestion, and at that word the striking ceased. The silence, the rhythmic disappointment of the silence, came as a fresh shock. For a moment one could doubt whether one had ever heard a sound, or whether it might still not be going on. Had I indeed heard a sound? I felt the pressure of Cavor's hand upon my arm. He spoke in an undertone, as though he feared to wake some sleeping thing. "Let us keep together," he whispered, "and look for the sphere. We must get back to the sphere. This is beyond our understanding." "Which way shall we go?" He hesitated. An intense persuasion of presences, of unseen things about us and near us, dominated our minds. What could they be? Where could they be? Was this arid desolation, alternately frozen and scorched, only the outer rind and mask of some subterranean world? And if so, what sort of world? What sort of inhabitants might it not presently disgorge upon us? And then, stabbing the aching stillness as vivid and sudden as an unexpected thunderclap, came a clang and rattle as though great gates of metal had suddenly been flung apart. It arrested our steps. We stood gaping helplessly. Then Cavor stole towards me. "I do not understand," he whispered close to my face. He waved his hand vaguely skyward, the vague suggestion of still vaguer thoughts. "A hiding place, if anything came." I looked about us. I nodded my head in assent to him. We started off, moving stealthily with the most exaggerated precautions against noise. We went towards a thicket of scrub. A clangor like hammers flung about a boiler hastened our steps. "We must crawl," whispered Cavor. The lower leaves of the bayonet plants, already overshadowed by the newer ones above, were beginning to wilt and shrivel so that we could thrust our way in among the thickening stems without serious injury. A stab in the face or arm we did not heed. At the heart of the thicket I stopped and stared panting into Cavor's face. "Subterranean," he whispered. "Below." "They may come out." "We must find the sphere." "Yes," I said, "but how?" "Crawl till we come to it." "But if we don't?" "Keep hidden. See what they are like." "We will keep together," said I. He thought. "Which way shall we go?" "We must take our chance." We peered this way and that. Then very circumspectly we began to crawl through the lower jungle, making, so far as we could judge, a circuit, halting now at every waving fungus, at every sound, intent only on the sphere from which we had so foolishly emerged. Ever and again from out of the earth beneath us came concussions, beatings, strange, inexplicable mechanical sounds, and once, and then again, we thought we heard something, a faint rattle and tumult, borne to us through the air. But fearful as we were, we dared essay no vantage point to survey the crater. For long we saw nothing of the beings whose sounds were so abundant and insistent. But for the faintness of our hunger and the drying of our throats, that crawling would have been the only quality of a very vivid dream. It was so absolutely unreal. The only element with any touch of reality was those sounds. Picture it to yourself. About us the dreamlike jungle, with the silent bayonet leaves darting overhead, and the silent, vivid, sun-splashed lichens under our hands and knees, waving with the vigor of their growth as a carpet waves when the wind gets beneath it. Ever and again one of the bladder fungi, bulging and distending under the sun, loomed upon us. Ever and again some novel shape and vivid color obtruded. The very cells that built up these plants were as large as my thumb, like beads of colored glass. And all these things were saturated in the unmitigated glare of the sun, were seen against a sky that was bluish-black and spangled still, in spite of the sunlight, with a few surviving stars. Strange! The very forms and textures of the stones were strange. It was all strange. The feeling of one's body was unprecedented. Every other movement ended in a surprise. The breath sucked thin in one's throat. The blood flowed through one's ears in a throbbing tide. Thud, 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 thud. And ever and again came gusts of turmoil, hammering, the clanging and throb of machinery, and presently the bellowing of great beasts. End of chapter.